And that little scene in the film had a profound effect on me, because it was in that moment of watching it that I realized for the first time that there were beliefs and cultures and ways of doing things that was different from what I knew. And everything changed for me then, because I understood in that instant as a little girl that there was so much more than what I experienced. And there were other ways of viewing life and of living, and there were other religions. And I kind of think that maybe even way back when I was little, that I already had a bit of a Buddhist heart within me. Because when we had thunderstorm warnings or tornado warnings, and when the rains would pour down and the winds would rattle the windows, I felt there was something sacred about it. I felt that there was a lesson in what I was being shown, and I couldn't articulate it then, but I knew that what I was seeing in the storm was something about realizing that nothing is in our control, that things change in a second, and that trying to fight it or being upset about it only creates unnecessary suffering. And it was in that inarticulated understanding of the storms that I felt a real peace and serenity. So I obtained my undergraduate degree in art history, and then in graduate school, I focused on Asian art history. And because so much of ancient art depicted religious themes, it was through that I learned in a bit of depth about the faiths of Asia, and especially Buddhism. I felt very drawn to learn more. And later on in life, I attended and was ordained at an interfaith seminary where we studied all faiths. And it was during my studies that I attended a different house of worship each month, including different sects of Buddhism, to learn more. But it wasn't until January of 2010 that I just discovered Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. I was working as a hospital chaplain in San Francisco, and I was living just a few blocks from Japantown when I just happened to stumble upon the Buddhist church on Octavia Street while walking my dogs one morning. And so the following Sunday, I was curious and interested, so I walked in and I immediately felt quite comfortable. I was welcomed so graciously by the people there. And as I also felt at home in the teachings and the beliefs of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. I found the Buddhist church as I was nearing the end of 24 years of living in California, because in 2013, a few years after my first encounter with Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, I decided to move back to Minnesota to be near my grandchildren. And it took a while, but I eventually found my way to this group of wonderful people. I am so thankful for the teachings of Shinran Shonin and for the compassion of the Amida Buddha. And I'm thankful to all of you who follow the teachings. I feel that as I first learned, and as I continue to learn more and more, that Shin Buddhism is something I have always known in my heart, and that I finally came home to it. To have been invited to study to become a minister's assistant in our Sangha was an honor I just don't deserve. I feel like I'm a little baby in my knowledge and my abilities, and I have so much to learn. But I am grateful and humbled to be welcomed in and to be allowed to serve our Sangha, and I'm dedicated to learning and continuing to learn and grow in my understanding. So, as I said, I originally gave this Dharma message a few weeks after Obon had taken place, and also after Reverend Ron Miyamura had spoken about the meaning and the traditions of Obon. I had been very moved by all that Reverend Ron had said, and I pondered his talk, and I pondered the Buddhist concepts that he touched upon, that of interdependence, of impermanence, of letting go, and of gratitude, especially in the relation to death and loss, since it was during the time of Obon. He spoke about the interdependence of life, and he talked about how many millions of people are the result of 25 generations. And that talk reminded me of an article I had read in the New Yorker over 30 years ago that has never left me. It stated that we all are minimally at least 16th cousins, or maybe even closer, with one another. And just like the funeral scene in that movie that I saw when I was a child, the New Yorker article had a huge impact on me as well. I thought that if I and everyone in the world really profoundly understood and took that to heart, that we're all actually related, then how could we ever be unkind? How could we have a war? For we're literally connected to one another. We would want good for others. Of course, since reading that article over 3 decades ago, the population of the world has grown immensely, so the mathematics might have changed. I tried to find corroboration on the internet, but I found articles that varied from proving we are 16th cousins to 50th cousins, depending on how it's looked at, how we count. But in any case, whatever the number, the fact of this information is that we truly are all interconnected. We are interdependent. Our cousins practice Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism, or we are a family of all races. And the man who cut in front of me on the freeway is of my own flesh. And the clerk at the pharmacy who berated me the other day for going to the wrong window for my flu shot, I'm related to her. And maybe she was just having a bad day. And I think we suffer when we don't embrace the truth of this, because after all, the experience of being human and the need for one another is what we all share. We all need a Sangha. So we know that Obon is traditionally a time to express our gratitude to and for the loved ones who have passed away, and it has been celebrated over 500 years in response to the great suffering we experience when someone we love dies. But in the midst of deep pain and loss, it is often hard to celebrate and to let go and to feel grateful, because that is being human, and it is in these ways of being human that we can understand how we are all connected and how we truly are cousins to one another, because losses are universal and the sorrow of loss is universal. I read a story once about a Zen Buddhist master whose son died unexpectedly in a car accident. He was grieving deeply, but his students were very perplexed. They inquired as to why he would grieve when he, of all people, understood that nothing is permanent. And his response was, yes, I do accept that nothing is permanent. And my son has died, and I am very sad. It is both. We understand and we grieve. We grieve and we understand, and we accept. And we are grateful. And I think that very human experience exactly points out how interdependent and interconnected we all are. It's these shared experiences of being human that help us to depend upon one another, to realize our interdependence as we empathize and comfort and feel joyful in our gratitude. The idea that during Obon, our loved ones who have died come back to us for a few days and sort of hang out on our front porch, as Reverend Ron Miyamura said, and then that they're sent back to their permanent dwelling place again with gratitude and love, is a beautiful celebration and an illustration of the way we love and the way we let go and how grateful we are for all of it. I have a favorite haiku. Many of you know how much I love Kobayashi Isa. He was a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist, and he lived from 1763 to 1828. And each one of his poems embody Shin Buddhist concepts. His poetry bubbles over with gratitude to the Amida Buddha. It conveys the human condition And it expresses his own experiences and understanding of the fleetingness of every moment, as well as his delight in the moments. And Esau was not a stranger to sorrow. He lost his mother when he was only 3 years old. And his first child, a son, died shortly after birth. His daughter died a little over 2 years later, and then a third child died. Esau outlived his wife, and he lost his house to a fire. He wrote, "This dewdrop world is a dewdrop world, and yet. Now, I understand he wrote this haiku on the 1-year anniversary of the death of one of his children. I love this poem because it encompasses it all. Life is so beyond our control and is forever changing, like a dewdrop rolling off a leaf. Life is as fleeting as a dewdrop, and so we must accept that and let go of our attachments. He's saying, I accept that and I embrace that, and I am even grateful for that. And yet, he is saying that he understands that he cannot hold on to anyone or anything. And he is saying, I'm sad. I want it to be different. We suffer and we grieve because we want it to be different. And that's very human. Because like Esau, I often want so much to hold on, to grasp, and to make a place for myself in this world that won't change and that feels safe. So I'd like to share with you a little bit of how in my own losses, I have come to understand interdependence through the generations of my own family. I've come to accept loss and to be gentle with myself about the very human desire to want to hold on, and ultimately to be grateful for it all. There is a saying that we are the descendants who are becoming the ancestors. So, as future ancestors, I believe it's important for us to share our own stories, to share and pass down our experiences of being human. I believe that is a vital part of being in a Sangha. Our stories are our individual stories, but the themes are universal. And I think that another way of saying that might be that we are interconnected, that we are interdependent. So my story, my mother died several years ago. She's been gone for a while now. But when she lived, she was so soft and kind and gentle. We grew up with very little, and yet my mother always managed to bring such joy and wonder and beauty to us. I so loved it when my mother would make a pot of tea, which she regularly did. And I would watch her stand at the stove and lift the kettle of boiling water, all ready to pour it into her pale blue ceramic teapot. It had golden flowers painted all around. And there was a chip on the spout, but I looked right past that because of the beauty of that teapot and the elegance and the comfort of sitting and having tea with her. My mother used to make pancakes in fun shapes. She would make Mickey Mouse, or sometimes she'd make them in shapes of letters. And then we would have to unscramble those letters with our fork, and they'd spell out our names, or they'd say, I love you. And sometimes we even had pancakes for dinner, and that was such a fun treat. That was my favorite. Although I now know that most likely my mother had been probably feeling quite desperate, probably worrying about how she would feed us on those nights. And she was actually trying to do what she could with what little we had, with an egg and some milk and flour. We never had maple syrup. She would take a little bit of brown sugar and heat it with water, and that's what we poured over our pancakes. And I didn't even realize that pancakes were eaten with anything else until I was an adult. I didn't know maple syrup existed. And when my beloved mother died, I was 50 years old and she was 85. And I couldn't imagine a future world in which my mother did not exist. I thought to myself, if I live to be the same age of 85, that means I have to live for 35 years without her. And I couldn't fathom it. And then I thought of how my mother had lost her own mom when she was only 15 years old. And so that meant she had lived for 70 years without her. And as I pondered that sad thought, it hit me that I had never actually met my grandmother. Of course I hadn't, because she died when my mom was a teenager. But the reason it was so shocking to realize this was because I had grown up with the many, many stories of my grandmother. My mother loved her so, and she talked about her all the time with such tenderness. And thus, my grandmother was a real presence in our lives, so much that I knew her. I felt I knew her. It was as if she was sitting on our front porch. And in fact, I grew up with the many, many stories told by my 13 aunts and uncles, my mother's siblings as well. And as children, it was our favorite thing to do. We would say, tell us about the time when our grandmother cut up her wedding gown, or tell us about the cake she made out of beans. And then we'd sit down and we'd listen to them share about their hardscrabble life growing up on the prairie land in northern Minnesota, which was warm through the love of their mother. They were very poor and they often went days without food. But one time, my grandmother took a cup of dried beans out of the cupboard in the morning, and somehow by afternoon, she had magically transformed those beans into a cake. Their neighbors, who were also quite poor, lost their baby unexpectedly, and my grandmother so wanted to help them. So she took the only beautiful thing she had ever owned, her wedding dress, and she cut it apart to make a soft lining for the baby's casket. My aunts and uncles told always loving stories of the ways of my grandmother. They spoke of her with such love, and they called her an angel. And when my children were growing up, I shared the family stories with them, the stories of my grandmother that I knew and yet had never met, the stories of my mother's life, and the stories of my own childhood. And they would say, tell us about the time when our great-grandmother cut up her wedding dress, or tell us about the time when our grandmother, my mom, would make pancakes with brown sugar water for dinner. And so, like my mother before, I told these stories, and I made pancakes for dinner for my children. And like my grandmother before, I made a cake out of beans. It's a chocolate torte that they love, and it's made from garbanzo beans. And then in 2009, my daughter died suddenly and unexpectedly at the age of 18. Her name is Esther, and she was a little homebody. As soon as she got home from school, she would make a beeline to her bedroom to change into her nightgown. That's all she ever wanted to wear. And so I made them for her. I sewed them for her out of soft flannel in pastel colors. And she and I often had tea parties after school, and the tea was brewed in the same pale blue teapot of my childhood, the one with the gold flowers and the chip spout. And my daughter loved to help me cook. When she was little, her job was to go outside with a basket to gather the herbs from the garden, the rosemary, the sage, the marjoram, and then she would clean them and get them ready for me to chop. And as she grew older, she took on more and more cooking duties. And I remember our last Thanksgiving together. We stood side by side that week all day in the kitchen, making stuffing and rolls and pies. And that year, she made a cranberry pie all by herself. It was her first pie and her last. She was so proud of it. And I remember how carefully she laid the lattice strips of pie crust on top, and she wove them in and out just so, and then sprinkled sugar on top. I can still see it all. But my daughter is gone now, and my mother is gone, and my aunts and my uncles are all gone. And most of the time, I hold these deaths so tenderly and with peace. But I also have my moments, just like the haiku poet Isa, when it suddenly will hit me, and I want it not to be true. I want my daughter back, and I long for my mother. And I miss the simple times of hearing the family stories told in the voices of my relatives who are long gone. After my daughter died, I thought to myself, as a mother, I had a picture that one day we would go together and pick out her wedding gown, or I would help her set up her first apartment. I had imagined we'd have years and years of preparing Thanksgiving dinner together, and perhaps her children would take on the job of gathering the herbs. I thought I would have all of that. I thought that was somehow promised to me, and it was taken away. But it's through the death of my daughter that I came to truly embrace, that I came to truly understand in the very heart of it all, the first of two of the four noble truths of Buddhism about suffering, and that we suffer because we want it to be different from what it is. Because I realized there was never a promise. It's never ever that things should unfold in a certain way, and that I should get what I think should happen. And it was also never about what she would get and be and do in life, because the world is indeed a dewdrop world. All that I was meant to do was to love and to be grateful for love. And I know that I loved with every fiber of my being, and she did, and my mother loved, and her mother loved. And I don't get to hold on to anything or anyone, no matter how many times I might grab tight and wish for things to stay the same. But in the midst of it all, such gifts, I had her for 18 years, and she lived 18 years of wonder and enthusiasm with a loving family. And I had my beloved mother till I was 50, and she had life and love. And we had pancakes for dinner, and we drank tea from a beautiful blue teapot, and we shared our stories. My life is incredibly rich from every moment that I spent with them. And my mother is in me, and my daughter is in me, and my grandmother, who I knew in my heart, is in me. We truly are interdependent, and we never really lose one another. I see that in our Sangha group. In the time that I have been with you, there have been deaths and loss. People have moved, new people have come, there's been health issues, new babies, and such loving camaraderie. I've seen the support and the compassion and the interdependence of this Sangha. Everything will change. We know that's true in this dewdrop world. But we have our Sangha composed of those, whether here on earth or in our hearts, that remind us we are all connected. This dewdrop world is a dewdrop world. And yet, the world is always changing like a dewdrop rolling off a leaf. It is ephemeral and fleeting. And yet there are pancakes and teapots, and there is the Sangha, and there is love. And so with deep gratitude, let us all bow our heads in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Thank you.